the major headline was that England would hold a general election. Only just under that headline in prominence in England was the electrifying news that Enoch Powell would not run for re-election. Mr. Powell gave out a statement to explain his refusal to run. What it said briefly was that he could not convincingly associate himself with the leadership of the Conservative Party by Mr. Heath. Indeed, Mr. Powell predicted that Mr. Heath would run on one set of professed convictions and proceed to manage the affairs of Britain by capitulating to the demands he was ostensibly resisting. If Mr. Heath wins, that is to say, that will not be known until later on this week. It is, by the way, a condition set by Mr. Powell that this exchange will not deal with the tactics of the pending campaign, and that it will not conclude with the usual questions posed by panelists. Mr. Powell has fascinated England for a long time. He has several constituencies. Whether they are discrete is an interesting question which I propose to touch on. He is most widely known here for three stands he has taken over the years. The first and most inflammatory has been his stand against unlimited immigration into England of colored people. His second has been his opposition to Britain's entry into the common market. And third, and here he is well known not only in English politics but internationally, as a theorist and profound advocate of the free market, the violation of which, in Mr. Powell's opinion, is at least one of the cardinal sins of the leader of his party, Mr. Edward Heath. It has always dismayed his critics that Mr. Powell is a man of rather extraordinary achievements. He is a certified academic, a scholar of Greek, a subject he taught for several years. He reads in 10 languages. In the course of all the political hustle and bustle, he produced a while ago a definitive account of the House of Lords in the Middle Ages. If only he were untutored and illiterate, he would greatly oblige everyone in sight. Meanwhile, speculation abounds that he is withdrawing now in the expectation of being called later to lead his country. I hope that as I question him on this point, he will not turn the question aside on the grounds that I am discussing a tactic of the campaign. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Powell why he believes that, having won a mandate from the British people, if indeed he does, Mr. Heath will proceed to conclude an unsatisfactory solution to the mine workers' crisis.
Because that is inherent in the circumstances. And may I say that you offered a very intelligent paraphrase of my letter to my chairman when I said that I should not be, we say standing, you in the United States say running again, for election, and that not unnaturally you somewhat personalized it, whereas from my point of view, the impossibility which I saw in front of myself was that in 1974 I should present myself to the same constituency, advocating on most of the important issues the opposite to the policies for which I had invited them to vote 4 years before. And whether it had been Mr. Heath or Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones, that would have been the same. And a more immediate possibility, and now I'm coming closer to your question, which indeed I will endeavor to answer head on. The more immediate impossibility I saw was of inviting the electorate to take or to approve the stance of the moment, the stance of the government at the moment, when I knew and they knew that that stance was bound very shortly to be altered, and that indeed the political reason for having the election so suddenly and in such unusual circumstances was that it was thought to be easier, having got, if possible, a majority, having 4 or 5 years ahead instead of 1 or 1 1/4, to do something which one had been resisting doing, and to alter a policy which was itself an alteration of the underlying policy of the Tory party. Now, to be precise, the prices and incomes policy, the attempt to control inflation,
What we call wage and price controls.
Wage and price control, by wage and price control, had run itself into the ground. Everybody knew that it had run itself into the ground. It was predictable that it was bound to do so. A freeze? Yes, you can have a freeze for a time. And then you say, well, what comes after the freeze? Oh, they say, we will allow everybody 4%. Well, that can go on for a time. But the world is a world of change, and relativities, whether they be of miners or ministers, are constantly altering. So you can't carry on long with 4% for everybody. And then comes the impossibility of all wage and price control. That some authority has to say exactly how much each price is to be, exactly how much each wage is to alter. Now, there's been no human machine invented which can do that other than the free market. And so that a clash is bound to come as soon as you get to that phase between reality as everybody perceives it and the theory of wage and price control. I couldn't have predicted that it would come over the miners, but it was bound to come over some group of employees, and it came.
Well, you're making a theoretical point on which, as I guess you know, I profoundly agree. What is not clear to me,
yes,
or to most Americans,
yes,
is why it is predictable that the government would, on the one hand, run on a particular diagnosis of the current problems, but predictably,
yes,
that it would turn its back on its own diagnosis.
Oh, that's quite easy, because everyone in Parliament and in the government knows that the theoretical bankruptcy of the wage and price control is about to become a real bankruptcy, that under some form or other it has to be abandoned. This is manifest to everyone in Parliament. It must be manifest to everyone in the government.
But you would welcome this, would you not?
Of course I welcome it entirely. That's one reason why I'm not going to fight a government in defense of the very theory and policy which I have denounced at the moment when it is about to be abandoned.
Well, and that you are not at liberty here in England to run for re-election on the Conservative Party label, while disagreeing with some of the particulars of the program as elaborated by the leader of that party?
Well, of course, every candidate can, to a certain extent, emphasize some parts and underemphasize others of the party program on which he is standing. But on the fundamentals, it is surely impossible, it seems to me impossible, for a candidate at a general election to be in antithesis with the line on which the party itself is fighting.
Well, would you explain exactly how you would have been in antithesis?
Well, the election is being fought in order to obtain public support and approval for the wage and price controls, and indeed for the very point at which those wage and price controls have now arrived, so that with that authority, so it is presented, the challenge of the unions can the more successfully be repelled. Well, this is...
But isn't the public understanding that the election is being fought on the notion of resisting an inflationary increase? Or do you actually interpret the plebiscite to be a call for an endorsement of the idea of wage and price control?
Well, it's necessarily an endorsement of the whole policy which has been pursued for the last 15 months of dealing with inflation by wage and price controls, and also of the final and, I would say, dying stage at which that policy has necessarily arrived, and consequently of the government's position of confrontation with the miners' union. And I would be seen to be, on the basis of all that I've said in Parliament and outside during these last 15 months, in total antithesis. Now, that is impossible. Now, it seems to me impossible.
Ms. Powell, are you talking about an impropriety, or are you talking about something more heretical than that? If you were to say to your constituency, look, I think wage and price controls are for the birds, they're not going to work, It's a lot of witchcraft that we have to dish out.
Yeah.
However, just as I wrote you in 1970 that I have disagreements with the party, but that the alternative is too heinous to consider, therefore I choose to stand. Would this result in your being read out of the party? Or,
well, it wouldn't result in that. It would result in my own moral and intellectual self-destruction. After all, in 1970, I may have emphasized, I may have overemphasized certain aspects of a party's official policy. And on the European Economic Community, I was fully entitled, as the policy stood at that time, to express a view against it. The question was left open at the 1970 election. But it's without self-destruction. A man can't stand up at an election, not at least if he's going to be heard. He can't stand up and say, I disagree with the very issue on which this election is being fought. I think it's an absurdity, but nevertheless vote for me as an official Conservative candidate, because then the next question would be, you're standing as an official Conservative candidate, does this mean that you want to see a Conservative majority in the next Parliament? Well, yes, I suppose so would be the answer. So you want to see a majority in favour of the very policy which you have been denouncing for 15, 18 months, which in speech after speech you have pointed out is absurd, and you dare to come in front of us and say, well, never mind about that, just vote me in. I couldn't do that.
Well, I can, as you phrase it, it is more a personal, intellectual and moral problem than it is a political one. Explain to me this.
Well,
why is it that in America, which is also self-governing, it is perfectly conceivable for somebody to run for the Senate or for Congress and say, the president has just enacted the authority, or rather used the authority given to him by Congress for wage and price controls. I don't think they're going to work. But it's better to have them administered by him, and in due course he'll grow out of it. Why would you consider yourself, if you were in America, as similarly incapacitated morally by running on a Republican platform, saying that kind of thing?
There seems to me to be a very great difference in this respect between your system and ours, in that in our system, party is not merely more important, party is of the essence. In your system, to a large extent, and of course almost wholly, it's your presidential decision, which is the nearest corresponding thing to our general election. You are voting for an individual, and there's a tremendous amount, so I understand, of cross-voting in the voting for the president, the voting for the Senate, and the voting for the House, so I understand. Now, that's impossible in this country. In this country, at a general election, the electorate is invited to say which party they wish to govern. And they do that by providing a majority of that party in the House of Commons. Therefore, it is an inconceivable contradiction to say, I'm standing as a member of that party. I therefore shall go to build up a majority, I hope, or do I hope, in the House of Commons for that party. But I disagree with the policy on which it's standing.
Well, is there a counterpart of Enoch Powell on the left in England that has the same difficulties in supporting, say, Mr. Wilson?
Well, there isn't at the moment, so far as I know. I'm sure there have been times where there was, but at the moment, and of course this is easier in opposition.
Yeah.
It is very much easier to unite in a policy which, although it has positive aspects, is seen primarily by the electorate as a reversal or a contradiction of the policy of a government in power. It's much easier to comprehend a wide spectrum of opinion. But I can't imagine that in any party it would be possible for a candidate, certainly not a candidate of any eminence or distinction or significance,
staying in
at a general election, to invite his electorate to support policies which they perfectly well knew he had consistently denounced.
Well, before we leave that point,
Yes.
let me just ask you finally, if you make it sound as though it was not only a logical decision by you, but an inevitable one, why is it that it took so many people by surprise?
I saw it as inevitable, and I think probably if people had done more thinking than it's fair to expect of them, they might have said, well, if an election is called at this moment, in view of the position which Enoch Powell has taken up, we don't see how he could stand.
But
it was most improbable until a few weeks ago that an election was even on the horizon. After all, governments don't usually call elections when their troubles are at the height and when the policies which they've been pursuing are about to run into the buffers at the end of the line. That's not usually the time of choice for calling an election. And I must confess that I myself, when the first election scare of 3-4 weeks ago, the first wave was over, I said publicly, well now, there's 15 months probably to go, and all sorts of things can change. And I had hoped that in that time we would have seen the collapse of wage and price controls, and we should have tidied them away into the political dustbin with more or less embarrassment, and that on many of the other issues too there would have been time for conservative government policies to evolve into a kind of, at any rate, tolerable agreement with the basic line of a Conservative Party and with the policies which we put forward in 1970. That hope has been disappointed.
Talk to me for a moment, if you will, Mr. Powell, about your retrospective view of the march of socialist sentiment, intellectual and emotional, in England. In 1970, when you were last on this program, shortly after the last election, you were mildly optimistic. You seemed to feel that many of the pretensions of socialism were being effectively challenged, and that in due course there was every expectation that sanity would be reintroduced. You seem less optimistic on this point now. Is this because the zeitgeist is unanswerable, or is this because the present leadership has not done what it might have done?
I'm never prepared to accept that you can't quarrel with the zeitgeist. The politician should never say that a trend is inevitable. It's his business to see to it that a trend, if he doesn't agree with it, is not inevitable. But I would be prepared to admit that if you wanted to make a case for the inevitability of a trend towards socialism, a very strong point that you could take up would be the fact that a Conservative government which came in 1970 with a radically market philosophy, prepared to let what we called the lame ducks, the inefficient and loss-making industries fall by the way, within 2 years was introducing legislation which not merely re-echoed the legislation of a socialist party, but exceeded their delighted dreams in providing them with the powers which they would need if and when they returned to office. Now, if you like to argue, which one could, well, this shows that there is a trend that way, and whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government, still one goes towards statism, I would see the force of it. I would still disagree. I would still wish to appeal till my dying gasp. And I would use the embarrassments of the present time as part of my case to the public to accept that that was not inevitable. On the contrary, that their own lives and the future of their country would look better if choice was more firmly planted with individuals and less concentrated with the state.
Well, in point of fact, the prescriptions for Great Britain, its way out of its current difficulties, are they easily yielded by the old classic economic texts, or are there modifications that one would need to make in virtue of the historical circumstances?
Well, let's look at the difficulties.
Yeah.
And let's start by looking at the most imminent difficulty, as a clash between government and trade unions.
Yeah.
Now, in all countries, ours and others, from time to time, collective bargaining leads to a strike. But a strike, except in a nationalized industry, is not ipso facto a direct clash between strikers, citizens, and government. So that's my first point against socialism, derived immediately from the facts of the present. Here is a strike in a nationalized industry, which, because the owner of the industry, and even more the banker of the industry, is the state, becomes a clash between the employees, not and the employer. Let them sort that out. But between the employees and the government as a political thing.
So that's an argument against a nationalization.
Yes, and secondly, we are seeing in this clash the consequence of a state having taken responsibility for fixing prices and wages. For it is the fact that the government has said, in our discretion, on our arbitrary will and interpretation, 16.5%, or whatever it may be, is what you are going to have, and for more you may neither strike nor bargain. It is for that reason that, even granted that this is a nationalized industry, the clash is so direct and brutal between a trade union which is acting entirely in accordance with the law, which has not broken any law, recent or long-standing. A clash between such a union and the government, in which the government is inviting at a general election, with my disapproval, the public to align itself on one side or the other.
Well, suppose the coal had not been nationalized and that there was a strike.
Yes.
What would have been the role of the government, in your opinion, under those circumstances to protect the public from the ravages of it?
Follow it through.
Yeah.
In the first place, it is obviously the duty of the government to ensure that the essential life of a community is carried on.
Right.
We have such powers, and the government would have public support in using them, even if that meant using the army to move supplies and to keep ports open and so on. We've done that before, we should do it again. But look at what comes next. Here is a clash between the employees and the employers. The employees believe that the employers can pay more. The employers say, sorry chaps, we can't pay any more. Well, they both know that there is a point at which they have to settle, strike or no strike. The employees know that there is a point beyond which, if they push it, they will push themselves out of work, and where the union will be discredited in the eyes of its own members. But in a nationalized industry, they always know that the political decision of government is there to print more money, to borrow more money, to provide more money.
Yes, of course, but the Arab sheiks have just finished showing that where there is an inelastic demand, there practically is no limit, as long as one could pass the cost along to the consumer. Suppose the coals mines had been privately owned, and they had asked for 33%.
Yes.
And yielding to force majeure, the producers have said, okay, and they just ran the cost of coal up.
On the contrary, the producers would have known that if they pay, and so would the miners, if they were going to pay 33% more, a good many of the less productive coal fields would have to be closed down, that production would have to be concentrated where a profit would still be shown, the price would go higher, the demand would fall, and all the relativities would alter. The men who lead the unions are not fools. They understand their supply and demand economics perfectly well. After all, that's what they live by. And their business is to find the best meeting point in the marketplace between the power of the market, the power of consumer demand, supply and demand, and the power of collective bargaining. But everything is altered when the state is the owner.
So well, are you saying that there is in England a historic record of exorbitant demands by publicly owned companies and industries?
What I am saying is that
compared to privately owned.
I'm certainly saying that the damaging clashes between state and citizen, this is almost a tautology, have occurred in those industries which, because they are nationalized, everyone knows are financed by the state, by the taxpayer, and where therefore the decision, which is otherwise a commercial decision, to say at this point we will face a strike, or we will give 5% but we won't give 10%, is not a commercial decision at all, but is a political decision.
Well, how do you how do you handle, say, demands for wage increases by policemen, let's say, something which is not easily denationalized? How do you apply your theory to in such a way as to ensure that you have moderation there?
In this way, and there's no mystery about it. The state decides how many policemen of what qualities and qualifications it wants. Now, it can't decide at what price they will be forthcoming. Not yet. The machine guns in Siberia are not yet available. So there are so many other openings open to those who might go into the police that the government, the state, the employer of the police has got to pay the market rate for getting men in the numbers it requires, of the quality it requires, under the conditions which are offered to do that job. It cannot vary that price.
All of this we recognize, but yes. This is not an argument. This is an analysis that would apply equally to mining coal. I'm saying, no. What is it that prevents, say, all of the policemen from getting together and asking for an exorbitant increase under the threat of a strike? Do you have any laws in England that prevent this from happening?
I think probably not. I would not be absolutely certain.
So there is a vulnerability there that is pre-socialist in origin.
Oh,
since
indeed, because
it
is a public service. Indeed, you could carry your argument further and say, what is it prevents the soldiers in the army from mutinying and saying, we want 50% more pay? And the answer is that the market is understood by everyone to determine what has to be paid to get a certain number of soldiers voluntarily, professional soldiers, to get a certain number of policemen. And immediately the state begins to underpay, it can't recruit. And the electors say, look what's happening to our army. Recruiting's running down. And the citizens start to say, what's happening to our city? The police force is diminishing. And so whoever maintains the police force, for most of our police forces are local, has speedily to put the rate up to the point at which they can voluntarily recruit the necessary numbers. But be it added that the job of a soldier and the job of a policeman is such that those who go into it voluntarily accept, and it is part of the attraction of those employments that you do voluntarily accept that your price is not going to be determined by collective bargaining against an employer, though it is going to be adequately safeguarded by the supply and demand for the service which you're offering.
Yeah,
There's no real mystery about
that. That didn't work with the post office, for instance, here a couple of years ago. How long was that strike?
No, I would hardly say that a post office employee regards his calling in the same light as a policeman, still less as a soldier.
Well, there was a great esprit de corps in America, or at least traditionally has been among people who live at the post.
What was happening there was basically that the government was saying, you are mistaken if you think that we need to maintain at the level for which you are asking that number or quality of post office staff.
And what happened?
And that was what was discovered. It was discovered that the telephone service and the other methods of communication had rendered the relative market position of the post office workers out of date. It was about as pure a testing of the market as you could imagine. It's true, it was a testing to destruction by a strike, but testing to destruction is implicit in any bargaining process, any free bargaining process.
To what extent are the adjudications of the market impeded by subsidies of the kind that Mr. Heath is threatening to withdraw? These social security payments and welfare payments and so on and so forth that makes striking less costly than the model would have it be.
I don't believe there's much significance in this whole debate.
You know,
it is obviously important that the public should not regard payments which are being made at their expense as being unreasonably made and made in unreasonable circumstances. But as to the incidence of strikes, I believe there's no evidence for suggesting that the incidence of strikes is related to the security benefits which are available for the families. And strikes were of as long duration and as ferocious, more so, when there were no such benefits as they are today. There has in fact been a recent change in the ruling governing these social security benefits, and I would defy anybody to relate the consequences of that change to any alteration in the incidence of strikes.
I see. Mr. Powell, 15 or 20 years ago, I think it was, Wilhelm Repke, the economist, said that in the recorded history of self-rule, no government has ever been thrown out for pursuing inflationary policies. What he went on to elaborate was that inflation is a sophisticated disease, and that it takes an intellectual orientation to move on to see tomorrow's consequences of today's inflationary pay rise. Now, if he is correct, does it follow that nobody in a free society is likely to achieve leadership primarily in view of that person's anti-inflationary position?
I disagree, by the way, when you referred to the inflationary consequences of a wage increase. I regard the wage increase as the consequence of the inflation, the symptom, the spots, and not the disease. I apologize for interpolating that. I wonder if Mr. Röpke is quite right. Technically, if he's saying no government has been actually thrown out on that point, that may be so. But after all, in one country after another, Germany in 1923 and Chile, is it, in 1973? France in 1958.
I think it would be
We find that the time comes when the public say, well, we may have been enjoying this. We did enjoy it up to a point. But the time has come now when the game has to stop. And whatever be the cost of stopping the game, and we recognize, and if politicians are honest, they'll tell them that there is a price to be paid for stopping the game, it has to stop now.
I think really what you're saying is that inflation leads to a whole series of social consequences, which indeed are palpable. But in inflation, and I'm now talking about the diminishing purchasing power of the pound or the dollar, is not something which in and of itself catalyzed a change of government in France in 1958 or in Chile in 1973. It was a whole series of other dislocations, mostly social in character and political. But what I'm therefore saying is...
That may be a distinction without a difference if the dislocations largely had their root and cause in inflation, because to be dislocatory is one of the characteristics of, certainly, of hyperinflation.
Yes. Yes, but if someone in England were to present himself, you for instance, as opposed to inflation, it would seem to me that that person's following would be adamant, informed, loyal, and patriotic, but probably not terribly numerous. It seems to me that it's only when an anti-inflationary position is wedded to a position that restores a sense of stability and a sense of order and a sense of a proper relationship between things, that you have the emergence of a leader whose pretensions escape the purely sectarian preoccupation with inflation.
It seems to me that you are reverting to a personalized view of politics, which seems to me to be very un-British. But immediately I translate what you've just put to me into party terms, then I'm confronted with the fact that all parties bidding for electoral support claim to be anti-inflationary, and indeed that mistakenly as regards method, but surely correctly as regards judgment of the public's wishes, the government even at this election is standing upon a policy on the ground that that policy will stop inflation. I don't believe it will, I don't believe it can, I believe it's a fundamental false analysis which underlies it of the causes of inflation. But they're not saying to the electorate, elect us and we promise you that inflation shall go on. They may indeed have acted, and they may continue to act in such a way that they would still regard the continuance of inflation as the lesser evil privately, but they wouldn't dare to say that publicly. And that seems to me a very good test.
Nobody comes out and says, I'm in favor of more inflation.
No,
Not
they
e-
come
not
out
even
and
in
say we're in
Brazil.
favor. No, they come out and say we're in favor of less.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
So how can you say?
But one assumes at any level of political intelligence that there is a rough correlation in the public mind between deficit spending and inflation.
I hope that
and that under the circumstances, what we really see, or as I understand it, what we really see, is particular groups hoping individually to profit relatively from an inflation that they can absorb and still come off better. This is the history of Brazilian economics over the past 30 years.
It may be in Brazil. I don't believe that is the case in this country. I don't believe that the miners or the shorthand typists or anyone else who seeks to secure and secures in terms of a money of falling value what is their relative market value, are saying to themselves, my word, this suits me. I'm getting higher wages all the time. I've got one possible exception. The really successful property speculator might well say, I hope this goes on for another 6 months. Mm-hmm. But apart from a tiny element in the community, it seems to me totally unrealistic to imagine that large masses of the public think they have a vested interest in inflation.
No, I didn't say that they had a vested interest in inflation. What I did say is that it is unsafe to suppose that people who support inflationary policies are so ignorant as not to be able to predict that they were going to be victimized by them unless they feel that their political leverage exceeds that of the other person, and that under the circumstances asking for 30% and anticipating an inflation of 20% still leaves them 10% ahead of the game. And this, I take it, is what the mine workers are up to.
If you ask for 33 and the third percent and get it when there is 20% inflation, then this will mean, by and large, that your relative market position is 12% above where it was before.
Correct.
Though it may have fallen 6% for all I know below in the previous years.
Correct.
And that has been expressed in terms of an inflated currency.
Yeah.
But I repeat, I do not regard the asking, which of course in itself is ineffective, or the obtaining of a 33 and a third percent increase as inflationary. Let me put this another way. Let us take the whole demonology. I've accepted holus bolus very well. This monopolistic trade union, by its apparently suddenly acquired, but let that point pass, its suddenly acquired market power is going to extort a real increase in wages of 10%, which has to be at the expense of every other section of a community. All right, suppose that is so. They're 10% better off, and everybody else is 0.0001% worse off in order to accommodate it. That doesn't cause inflation. That's nothing to do with inflation. That has been happening since the beginning of the world. One price went up and another price.
Yeah.
It's just redistribution.
Yeah.
And redistribution in itself has nothing to do with inflation. Inflation is caused, in my view, by the way in which a modern government handles what in the modern world is money. And if you were saying, as at one moment I thought you were saying, that a section of a community who call for, let's say, more expenditure on education, a stronger police force, stronger defense forces, are asking for inflation because if you added those all up and didn't accommodate the total at any one time to the amount which was coming in from taxation or genuine borrowing, you would have inflation, then I think that is a misjudgment of the way in which the electorate either behaves or can behave. After all, naturally the electorate say, these are the sort of things we would like. But they don't thereby absolve the government from the duty which only the government can perform of maintaining a balance between what we want and what, without deceiving ourselves with inflation, we can obtain.
I understand, and I guess my question to you is how widely, in your judgment, is that understood?
Increasingly. And I would hope that this last episode of the wages and price control, which of course we've had now 4 or 5 times since the war, it's a bad film, and we've had to sit through it 4 times already. And we all know how the plot ends, except that there seems to be more shooting at the end every time it's replayed. And I would hope that we had now learnt that inflation is not a game of cops and robbers, but that inflation is something that government, if you don't tell them that they will be punished for doing it, will indulge in. After all, in the Middle Ages, the princes and monarchs who put lead in the currency had a good time as long as it went on. But in the end, their subjects said, look, what's this sort of stuff that you're fobbing us off with? And they had to restore the value of money.
Well, if since neither of us supposes that Mr. Heath had as some sort of a congenital quirk a fascination for seeing that old film yet another time, we must assume that, as is the case in America, he felt obliged to resort to wage and price controls on the grounds that the public had some confidence in them. Now, is this a pedagogical strategy, i.e., is he saying, okay, this is what you wanted, I'm going to show you the film one more time, and at the end I'm going to turn to you and say, look, don't you understand, it doesn't go.
No.
Or is he himself, do the blandishments of wage and price controls begin all of a sudden to appeal to himself athwart his own intelligence?
Well, certainly not the first of your alternatives. There were no mob hammering at the gates and saying, give us the prices and incomes policy, give us wage and price control. But also, I don't think he was fascinated, though all bureaucrats are fascinated. And once you let the bureaucrats get at it, they'll pile one control on another. Go to a bureaucrat and say, look, I'm in a jam. He's unlikely to say, well, the trouble is you've got too much administration. The trouble is you've got too many bureaucrats. The trouble is you've got too many controls. It's likely that once a bureaucracy is entrusted with, or is even given an opportunity to suggest control of wages and prices, that they will not be reluctant to pursue that line as far as it will lead. But I don't think that this was a quirk. Indeed, I'm sure he was entirely truthful when he said at the 1970 election, we utterly reject the philosophy of compulsory wage control. Those are words out of our 1970 manifesto. I think what happened was this. In 1972, unemployment was emerging as a result of the fall in the rate of inflation, which over a year fell from a rate of about 10% to a rate which was coming down to the neighborhood of 5%. And the government decided, rightly or wrongly, that the lesser evil electorally was to resume inflation and reduce and prevent the unemployment from continuing to emerge. But of course you don't say that. You don't say we've decided that we must go back to 10% inflation a year. Nor do you say that the consequences of reducing taxation by 1,300 million and increasing expenditure by 2 billion is inevitably going to be inflationary.
You just do it.
You just do it and say, look how we've reflated the economy. Wonderful expression. Look how we've got the unemployed back to work.
Did that happen? Did that happen?
Yes, that duly happened. It happened in absolute textbook fashion. But then you say, yes, but now who are we going to blame for the inflation? We can't say, this was the price which we decided you would like to pay for having 500,000 instead of 850,000 unemployed. And so the temptation became once again irresistible to pretend that inflation is generated by other sources. And once you pretend that, once you say, well, it's the people who ask for wage controls, it's the uncompetitive manufacturers, it's the greedy capitalists, or what you will, then of course everybody says, well, go on, you've got the powers, take more powers if that's what's causing it, and you find yourself caught, you find yourself playing the same film again. That's what happened.
Well, how do you handle the argument, Wedgwood Ben, for instance, uses it rather directly, that it is better to have 10% inflation and 300,000 fewer unemployed?
Well, I handle it in this way, that in order to keep the level of unemployment, first of all, to keep the level of unemployment permanently down to that level, you would need not continuous inflation at a steady 10%. Because if that's going to go on steadily, then everyone will discount for it. Mm-hmm. You have to have ongoing inflation if you are to maintain that level of over-employment, over-full employment as it is called. So this is an argument, not for going on at 10% inflation. This is for inflation increasing ad infinitum, and I have yet to hear a politician commend that. But could I say something about what, in my view, is very important to be understood about the relationship between inflation and unemployment?
Sure.
And which is very difficult to get over, because the opposite view is so deeply rooted in the public mind, and I think probably not only in Britain. It is this, that it is neither stable money nor inflation at X% which causes or prevents unemployment. But unemployment is caused or prevented by the change of gear, upwards towards faster inflation or downwards towards slower inflation. And
any movement.
It is the change, it is the movement, because the movement, one way or the other, defeats expectations. Today in this country, people are calculating on inflation in 1974 being at the rate of what, 15%? I fear so. Well, I hope they're wrong. And if the government's profession that its policies will control inflation are borne out, then they will be wrong. But if they are wrong, there are a lot of them that will catch a cold. And catching a cold means dislocation, temporary disuse of resources, and temporary unemployment, and vice versa. If you suddenly find that the demand for your goods, the money demand for your goods is going up beyond what you anticipated, then you take on more men, you order more plant, and of course the level of activity temporarily rises. So the essence of the matter is that these are essentially transitional phenomena. And this is why over and over again I've said and tried to hammer in, there is a price to be paid if you are inflating at 10% for regaining stable money. There is a price to be paid if you don't want to go on 10, 15, 20, 25%, even for staying at 10%. But my friends and fellow countrymen, I believe that price is worth paying. And you will have to pay that price sooner or later, for you can't go on and on in the same direction. You better face it now. You better accept that it has to be paid. And you better put your confidence in a party which will do it.
Well, do you envision yourself addressing your countrymen with this message in the months ahead? Well, obviously in an academic way, certainly, but in a political way? Or are you now stripped of any possibility of speaking to your countrymen as a political figure?
More so in Britain than would be the case in the United States. I often say something about you, Bill, to my friends. I'm one of your great admirers. I often say, you know, Bill Buckley is an essentially American phenomenon. Because there's a man who is active as a politician. That man's an important politician. He's a political force in the United States. Don't correct me if I'm wrong. But if he were in Britain, he'd have to be in Parliament.
Why?
Well, you can't be a politician in Britain unless you're in Parliament, or at any rate unless you intend to be in Parliament. For the whole of a political debate in Britain is a parliamentary debate. Even the journalistic debate about politics is focused upon Parliament.
Well, the final
Parliament
transaction,
and party.
the final transaction is in Parliament. But you can't tell me, for instance, that the least member of the House of Commons is more influential than Bernard Levin or Peregrine Worsthorne, just to give two
but
examples.
those are either entertainers or journalists. They're in the entertainment business, or they're in the froth ocean business, if I may so describe journalism. They're not men whose life is devoted to a political purpose. In this country, a man whose life is devoted to a political purpose is a parliamentarian. Now, in the United States, he can take many other forms than wanting to be in the House of Representatives. And you're one of them.
But I don't
You're
quite...
not just a journalist.
I don't quite... I see your point there, but I don't quite understand why it is considered to be different in England. Mr. Heath makes policy as the head of his party, and he is influenced by X number of people. There is no law that says that the people who influence him must be members of Parliament. I don't see why you have to stop influencing him the moment that you say goodbye to Wolverhampton.
Well, of course, I could influence him as a civil servant if I were a civil servant. I could influence him, I suppose.
Lord Keynes was never in
Well, I
Parliament.
was about to say, as a prominent academic, I wouldn't be influencing him, I'd be influencing the next generation, or the next generation would want, when circumstances had entirely changed, but let that pass. I could possibly influence him as a clergyman from the pulpit. I can influence him in all sorts of ways, but this would not be politics. You see,
And
it seems to me one of the
therefore
contrasts
you are forswearing not only a seat in Commons in your understanding, but also politics. You are no longer a political figure. You are now an ex-political figure and an academician and an evangelist.
Don't run away with me, please. Politics in Britain revolves round Parliament. It is concentrated, as all power in Britain is concentrated, in a way which is totally strange to the United States, where power is very much more, of all kinds, is very much more diffused than we imagine. But I have to answer your personal question by saying quite simply, and it's the simplest things I know which are hardest to believe, I found myself confronted with a proposition that I should act in a way in which I found it impossible to act. And so I said, I won't. I hadn't engineered that. I hadn't wanted it. I hadn't even expected, as I explained to you earlier. But it happened, so I said, well, whatever else, I can't do that. That doesn't mean that I can foresee what the consequences of my action will be. That doesn't mean that I can foresee whether somehow I have another 20 years as a politician, on my definition, as a politician in Britain, or whether I shall never be a politician again. I can't foresee that. But I didn't say, now let me see. What will be the consequences to me in 5 or 10 years' time? I didn't say that because I didn't find any alternative, because I simply couldn't imagine myself standing up in front of my electors and standing up in front of the country, which listens, and saying things which they knew that I didn't mean, and advocating support for policies which they knew that I had denounced. It's so simple.
Out of curiosity, would you have had to have campaigned at all?
Yes, of course.
You were, I mean, couldn't you have, say, gone on a trip to South America and come back and been re-elected?
No, that's inconceivable.
Is it
first
really
of all, it would have been understood why I did it.
I know, sure, I know. Intending to communicate your reservations in that rather poetic way.
No, that wouldn't do. That would have simply been seen as the most ludicrous and pathetic cowardice. I would have been running away from the dilemma, and I would have seen to be. But in the
they could have punished you if they wanted to.
No, but listen. In that I had permitted myself to be re-elected as a Conservative member, I should have been doing, but tacitly instead of openly, what I found it impossible to do by campaigning.
Well, but it would have relieved you at least of the burden of causing your lips to utter words that you didn't believe.
I really think this is just a fairy tale.
I see. It's never happened. Well, I don't expect. I didn't mean to ask you
I can't guarantee that it's never happened.
It would be considered undignified.
But for someone who has aspired to be heard, who has aspired to influence governments and to shape policies, to spend the 3 weeks of an election in the South Sea Islands and still to be elected. That's even more humiliating, if you can imagine it, than to campaign saying the opposite to what everyone knows that he believes. It also would be bad manners.
Yeah, and yeah, that's right. And bad manners leads to murder, as Stendhal said. Well, you did make, and I did not intend to personalize it, you made really a categorical statement that in England, if you are not in the House of Parliament, you are outside politics.
Well, and, I suppose I should have said you could be in the House of Lords, outside Parliament.
Yeah, outside Parliament, outside Parliament. But to which I countered, it is inconceivable that your lapse, that there would be a lapse in your interest in your country merely in virtue of your having left the House of Commons. Under the circumstances, you're obviously going to look for other forums, and it will be for other people to judge whether you are more or less influential speaking from other forums. But I take it that you deny flatly that you can be influential outside Parliament.
Well, you used a rather far-fetched proposition just now about going to the South Sea Islands during a general election. I'll use a far-fetched one in replying to your question. Suppose I had felt so strongly about my country that I joined up in a war and went over the top in an assault and was shot through the head. I'd have died for my country, but it would hardly be appropriate to ask. And now, my dear friend, what do you intend to do for your country in future?
I understand. Thank you very much, Mr. Powell. I appreciate very much our conversation.
So do I.
Next week on Firing Line, economist, author, and Harvard Law professor Stanley Surrey joins Mr. Buckley for an exchange of ideas on tax reform.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.